King Saul is the first king of Israel to be anointed by God. But King Saul does not listen to God. He lives according to his own way and disobeys God. And so, the Spirit of God who was with King Saul leaves King Saul and chooses a new king that will replace him. That new king is David. God, who does not look at a person's appearance, but at the person's heart. God is so pleased by David's heart that he anoints him to be the next king of Israel. After being anointed, David lives by the Spirit of God. When one day he comes to face the giant Philistine Goliath, and as you know, David heroically defeats Goliath with one sweeping blow.
You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. Take that.
David's stone hits Goliath in the forehead, and Goliath falls immediately to the ground. David becomes a hero of Israel. Wherever he goes, he acts wisely, and his popularity and fame soars sky high. But King Saul is jealous of David's popularity. Convinced that David is after his throne, he decides to kill him. Feeling threatened, David seeks out his friend Jonathan for help. And Jonathan, who deeply cares for David, tries to stop his father, but fails to do so, and decides to help David escape to safety. Before parting ways, the two covenant to protect each other and each other's family. Then they embrace each other and weep for each other. From then on, David spends his days fleeing from King Saul. One day, even though he has the chance to kill King Saul, David chooses to spare his life and only cuts King Saul's robe. Everyone thought David's life would be a never-ending story full of joy and happiness. After all, he had been chosen and anointed by God. But in fact, his life is a series of attempts to run away and is filled with loneliness and sufferings. While he is suffering, the people of Israel, who are also suffering for different reasons, gather around him. David listens to their pain, suffering, and he comforts them and stays with them. His circumstances are certainly not ideal, and he is in debt and in suffering. But it is during these difficult times that he meets the people who will be with him throughout the rest of his life. This is a blessing from God. It had been almost 10 years since David had first started running from King Saul. Rather than becoming king of Israel, David lives as a fugitive fleeing from one nation to the next. When a battle between the Philistines and Israel begins. In this battle, King Saul and his sons all die. Israel suffers a terrible loss, and the wails of the people can be heard from all corners of the earth. Israel needed a new king, someone who would help them overcome this terrible suffering. The Israelites find David and ask him to be their king. And so, David finally becomes the king of Israel. David was anointed and chosen to be the king, but for a long time he lived like a beggar, in debt and in suffering. However, in the end, God sits David on the throne, and through David, God carries out his will. Through all the trial and tribulations, young David becomes Israel's true king.